I was hanging out with a bunch of my friends over Thanksgiving break. We all go to different colleges, so this was one of the few times that we were actually able to get together. The group consisted of the usual suspects, which included Adam, Zach, Luke, Brandon, Mario, and myself. We always ended up at Mario's house and would tend to keep to the basement because of its size and seclusion from any unwanted attention. Mario's house is giant, and his basement is no exception. Apart from being very spacious, the basement is also nicely furnished, carpeted, and very comfortable to stay in. During most of our get-togethers, there's a fair amount of drinking, and after a while of being cooped up in the basement, my friends and I started to get rowdy and wanted to drive out to the local club. I'm not much of a drinker, so I usually stay pretty sober during these events. Thus, I'm usually left as the designated driver for everyone. Normally, I'm alright with driving everyone to the club. But during this specific night, I was really against going out. There were several reasons for this. 1. I would have to drive 5 drunkenly annoying people in my truck the day before Thanksgiving, which has the reputation of being the day with the most drunk drivers. I didn't want any of my friends to get an underage drinking violation, even though several of them already had one. I would also get into trouble if the police happened to find alcohol in my bloodstream, which they definitely would have. The second reason why I didn't want to go to the club because there was a high probability that one or several of my friends would end up in a fight. They tended to provoke people when they're drunk. This again leads to the police and underage drinking and all that damaging stuff. I really wanted to stay at Mario's and just hang out in the basement, but they were adamant about going out, and it was 5-1, so I finally caved in. And as the time came closer to leaving, my friends became more and more rambunctious. I had to go upstairs in order to retrieve my keys, so I left my loud friends roughhousing in the basement. I found my keys resting on a table in Mario's kitchen, but while I was walking over to get them, the lights went out. I stood still wondering what the hell just happened. But a few seconds later, the lights came back on. I didn't really think much about it, and went over to grab my keys off the table. That's when I noticed something else, and stopped moving. I couldn't hear the muffled noises that my friends were making below me anymore. I just shrugged it off, assuming that they had started to calm down, which was a good sign. I went back downstairs, but I was surprised to find that none of my friends were there anymore. The back door to the house was located in the basement, so I assumed that they had left through that, and were heading to the cars parked in the driveway. I quickly followed them through the back door, and started heading towards the driveway myself. I got to where the cars were parked, but once again my friends were nowhere to be found. Everyone drove up to Mario's house separately, and I got scared for a second, thinking they all piled into someone else's vehicle and took off intoxicated. But I counted the cars, and saw that all of them were still there. It was the middle of November, so it was cold as shit out, and I wanted to go back inside. But I decided to take a quick lap around the exterior of the house, just in case they were out there smoking or something. I walked around the entire house, but I didn't see or hear anything. So I went back inside through the back door. They still weren't in the basement, but they could have gone upstairs without me knowing. Since the basement is so big, there are 2 stairwells on either side of the room that were separated by a wall. I deduced that while I was coming down one of the stairwells, my friends had gone up the other one, probably looking for me. I went up to the first floor again and looked around for my friends, but once again, I couldn't find anybody. There was no way they went up to the second floor. The last thing that Mario would want was to wake up his dad while he was drinking. I went up anyway and looked around for my friends, trying to make as little noise as possible. I couldn't find them on the second floor. The only place left inside the house was the attic, but that was almost impossible for them to get into. They would need a chair just to reach the handle, and it was also locked from the outside. At this point, I was annoyed and confused. Where the hell did they go? I went back down to the basement and called Mario on my phone. It started to ring, but I could hear the on the coffee table next to me. Mario had left his phone. I tried calling Zach. It went straight to voicemail. I tried calling Luke. Same thing. Then Adam and Brandon. Every single one went straight to voicemail. I didn't know what to do at this point besides wait. I just sat there on the couch alone in the basement. I wasn't moving at all. I was just listening to nothing. It was really creepy in the basement all by myself. I don't want to come off as cliché by saying that it was almost too quiet, but that's exactly what it was. It's hard to describe the stillness that I was feeling. The best way I could put it was that I could literally hear the silence around me. I was starting to freak myself out and wanted to turn on the TV. I was about to stand up and get the remote when I heard something. It was very soft, but I knew I heard it. I stood still and let the silence consume me. After a few seconds, I heard the same thing again. It was still very soft, but I could tell what it was. It was snickering. The kind of snickering that you make whenever you try to suppress a laugh by putting your hand over your mouth. That's when it hit me. My friends were hiding somewhere and laughing at me. They obviously didn't want to be found, which is why they were trying to hold back their laughter. Once I figured out what the noise was, I became very annoyed. My friends were intentionally hiding from me even though I was getting genuinely worried about where they were. I got up and started looking around for them again, thoroughly checking all the closets in the basement. There were a lot of them. While I was looking, the snickering started to become more distinguished, but I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I was at the end of the room, and I would hear the snickering behind me, but once I went over to the opposite end of the basement, I would hear it behind me again. As I mentioned before, the basement is a big area, with a lot of closets and closed rooms, but there are only so many places that a person can hide, and I felt like I checked all of them. Yet the damn snickering was still going on, and it was very noticeable at this point. Then, all at once, it stopped. It cut off out of nowhere, and the lights went out once again. There was no way that my friends could choreograph a stunt like this, especially while they had been drinking. Something was wrong. Something felt off, and it was at that exact moment I started to become scared. Standing in the middle of the dark basement, not moving, and was once again in complete and utter silence. It felt like I was in a nightmare and wanted to wake up more than anything. Instead, I just stood there, too petrified to move. That's when I could hear footsteps. The floor was carpeted, so they were quiet, but I could hear them clear as day. They were coming from my right, but they weren't the type of footsteps that you would expect. These were very particular. They were taken slowly, carefully. Each step was followed by a few seconds of silence, as if whatever was walking did not want to be heard. Something was creeping closer to me. I dared not move my body, but I searched frantically with my eyes, trying to see what was approaching. It was still pitch black, but I could swear I could make out a figure advancing towards me from the right. I closed my eyes and started to cry. I couldn't help it. Warm tears slid down my cheeks as I braced myself for the worst. Then the lights came back on, and I almost screamed. I looked around, but there was no one in the basement with me. The snickering was gone, and I felt lightheaded from the amount of terror that was flowing through me. I was horrified, and I didn't want to be in that room by myself any longer. I still had no idea where my friends were, and as much as I wanted to leave, I still didn't want to leave them behind. If this was some kind of elaborate prank that my friends were trying to scare me with, it worked. But the joke was over, and they would have to come out of hiding by now. I texted each of my friends saying that I was going to leave if they didn't come out. I tried calling each of them 3 times, but like before, they all went straight to voicemail, except for Mario's, which was still buzzing on the coffee table. I told myself that I would give them 5 more minutes to respond, and then I was out of there. 5 minutes passed, and I was leaving through the back door and heading towards my truck. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning at this point. I was tired, scared, and annoyed. I honestly didn't know what to make of the situation. Once I got home, I started to realize how stupid I was for thinking that there was some monster in the basement with me. I knew my friends were just trying to scare me for whatever reason. and I'm sure that I gave them the exact reaction that they were looking for, me crying by myself in the dark. They probably had it on video too, and were going to post it on every single media platform they could. I no longer felt bad for leaving them behind. As a matter of fact, I felt betrayed by them. I spent over an hour worrying about where my friends had disappeared to, and tried looking for them, and in return they scared the living shit out of me and made me feel like I'm an idiot. I went to bed and waited anxiously for the morning to come so I could give my friends hell for what they did. When I woke up the next morning, I immediately went for my phone and was shocked to find that Mario had sent me a text around 3:30 a.m. I opened the text to find nothing but gibberish. It clearly looked like a drunk text. I really wasn't surprised by this. Mario had sent me many drunk texts before. It was almost 11 a.m., and if the guys had stayed up all night drinking, there was no way that any of them were awake yet. I decided to wait it out and make them call me first. It wasn't too long after I woke up that I received another message. This time it was from Mario's dad. "Did you guys go somewhere? I can't seem to find anybody. I actually left last night. I don't know if they went somewhere, but I couldn't find them either. Have you tried calling or texting any of them? I keep getting their voicemail." "Yeah, I'm getting the same thing." "Alright, well if Mario or anybody else calls, you tell them to call me so I know where they are." "Will do." About 2 hours later, Mario's dad texted me again. "Hey, have you heard anything from your friends yet? Mario and I were supposed to go somewhere today, but he still isn't answering his phone." "No, sorry, I haven't heard anything from them yet." I still hadn't told them about the drunken text, because Mario's dad hates it whenever Mario and his friends come over to drink. Around 4 p.m., Mario's dad messages me once again. "Have you heard anything yet? I'm starting to get worried. All the other parents are starting to call me asking me where everyone is. I've tried calling Mario and everyone else over and over again, but none of them are answering." "I still haven't heard anything, but I'll try calling them myself. Don't worry, I'm sure they're fine. They probably stayed up all night over someone else's house and have been sleeping in all day." "Okay, just please tell me if you hear anything." I started texting and calling my friends again, but I still wasn't getting anything. Another 3 hours go by. It's a little past 7 at this point. I was starting to get very worried, but I didn't realize how serious the situation was until I got a knock on the door. It was the police. They informed me that Mario's dad and several of the other parents reported their sons missing. I was driven back to Mario's house and was greeted by several other police officers, as well as all of my friends' worried parents. The parents kept asking me questions about what we were doing last night and where their children had gone, but I honestly didn't know. I just kept reassuring them that everybody was alright, but after a while, even I was starting to doubt myself. 2 police officers, one skinny and one fat, escorted me into the basement. They kept asking me questions and I answered as best as I could, but I was starting to become delirious from everything that was happening. I told them the whole story, starting from when I went upstairs to get my car keys. I told them about the snickering and how the lights went out. I told them about the figure I saw creeping towards me in the dark. At this point, I didn't care how crazy it sounded. I just wanted my friends to be okay. I told them about the drunken text I got last night, and when I showed them the message, the fat cop took my phone and walked away with it. I was left with the skinny police officer, who continued to ask me questions. I asked him if Mario's dad had found his phone on the coffee table. The officer told me that Mario's dad found no such thing. I informed the officer that I distinctly remembered seeing Mario's phone on the coffee table and had assumed that he retrieved it later, which would explain the drunken text I got from him last night. He wrote down a couple more notes and left, telling me to stay where I was. I was back in the basement, standing almost exactly where I was when the lights went out. The scene now, compared to last night, was completely different. There were detectives everywhere looking over everything, dusting for fingerprints and asking questions. I closed my eyes and zoned out for a while. I was sucked back into reality when the fat officer yelled for me to come over. He was standing next to some geeky-looking guy wearing glasses. Once I got over to them, the fat cop asked me if I was playing some kind of sick joke. Stunned, I asked him what he was talking about. The guy with the glasses was the first to answer. He informed me that the text that Mario had sent me last night was not gibberish. It was Latin, and translated to,
"Your friends are with me now."
Now this happened in my senior year of high school when I was 17 years old, about to turn 18. I'm a 5'3", 90-pound female who, from a very early age, has been lusted over by much older men. So by 17 years old, I had been experiencing it for 6 years now. So by that age, I was already very used to the really creepy gazes that I would randomly receive out in public. But Mr. B, he always gave me more than just a gaze. Though I moved around often and went to very many different schools, Mr. B was the first teacher I had who gave me the creeps on a daily basis. I had a sub or two in the past sneak glances at me or even one who gave me his number, but I never saw them again. With Mr. B, however, it was a daily thrill of anxiety as I always wondered what was next, and as you'll see, it would eventually progress beyond school. I had Mr. B first period, and as a senior who had chosen it as a science elective, I was definitely relaxed and I enjoyed talking to my friends often throughout class. As I said, it was supposed to be an elective science class, but he would often ramble off the entire class periods into his specific political and religious views, or just play an unrelated war movie as he had talked to me and my group of friends. Imagine walking into a room and facing 12 o'clock and Mr. B facing towards the door, while the rest of the seats are in front of him facing 3 o'clock. The flag was at like 10 o'clock, so when we did the pledge, we had to stand up and turn around. That'll become relevant later. With the way the seats were, I sat almost directly in front of him, slightly to his right at the back of the class. For whatever reason, he would often intervene in my group's conversations, but no one else's. He would comment on our appearances, which we would always share really blatantly weirded out looks at him. My main 2 friends and I were the weird kids, so all 3 of us were all pretty much in black. I had long red hair, light blue contacts, piercings, and often wore super tall heels. He would always compliment me and tell me how much older I looked, and as the awkward person I was, I would kinda just laugh and thank him and keep my eyes down. Soon during the pledge, he would scoot almost 5 feet over towards me that he could genuinely have his entire left side pressed against my right side as we did the pledge. He would often keep glancing at me and smiling at me as he would do it, sometimes leaning on me so much that I would almost topple over. But because of the design of the room, as I explained before, this left the entire class behind us, and with them all completely able to see this going on. It was because of this that I somehow justified it in my mind that maybe it was okay. I mean, if it was really a big deal, he wouldn't be doing it in front of the entire class like that, right? But it would continue to progress. The pledge thing became a daily occurrence, and even though my friends thought it was weird, they really liked Mr. B. I mean, we had virtually no work in that class, so I just kept my thoughts to myself. He began having us do these really super basic posters because he said it needed some assignments to put in, and as we pushed the tables into groups of 4, with everyone leaning over and working on them, he would slide his body against mine, completely pressed against me for way too long, letting his hand linger on my lower back as he passed. Or sometimes while we sat in class watching all the videos, he would tend to pass me and stop behind me, resting his hand on top of my head for a moment and then running his fingers all through my hair, before then returning to his seat. The first time he did that, I actually completely froze and whipped my head around in disbelief. But no one else noticed, and he had this really weird smirk on his face. I had so much other stuff going on with me beyond that class with him that I didn't really think about it that much at first. But then Mr. B began staring me down in the hallway, to the point that my own twin commented on it before I even told her everything that had been happening. It was only when she said that when I told her everything. She agreed that what he was doing wasn't right and that she got bad vibes from him as soon as she saw the way he looked at me. But the looks in the hall or even the touching in class wouldn't have made me post this here. It's when I began seeing him more outside of school that he caught more of my attention. So I worked at a gas station by myself after school right down the road from the high school, and often until close, and I would also be there on the weekends. As I said, I talked to a few of my friends in the class, and I think this is how he found out so much about me. On the very same day that my job got brought up during class, Mr. B showed up at my gas station later that afternoon, filling up his pump. As the bell chimed when he strutted in the gas station, he smiled wickedly at me from over the counter and asked me a ton of questions. How I liked working there, if it was safe, if I got asked out a lot, etc. I frowned at the latter question, and I told him honestly that a lot of creepy men were constantly hitting on me. I unblinkingly stared at him for a moment, trying to get my point across, but he didn't notice. He was full on leaning over the counter with his elbows on the counter looking at me when one of my regulars then walked in. He immediately straightened and he told me he'd see me tomorrow. My regular approached with raised eyebrows in question as I just rolled my eyes as he asked, an admirer? I snort and reply flatly, no, he's my teacher. To which the guy makes a pained face and wags a finger at me as he says, "You be good now. You don't want anyone losing a job for you." Before I can reply something snarky back, he walks out laughing. Mr. B began to frequent the gas station pretty much weekly, and he would stare at me shamelessly with that same smirk every time. He would ask me about college, where I was going, what I wanted to do, pretty normal questions. He would also brag to me about how much he loved playing guitar and that sometime I should check out his band, and that it seemed like my type of music. And every time he came in, he would look to the left, then to the right, stare down at me, and then dramatically ask, "Do you know all the things that could happen to you alone in here?" I would assure him that I was safe and that I had a baseball bat and a panic button, to which he'd just shake his head and then say, "That wouldn't stop me if I really wanted someone." He would come so frequently that at one point during the weekend, one evening my stepmother was there, unbeknownst to him, and he then came in and said something like, "Do you know just how much trouble a girl like you could cause a grown man?" And then referencing the song playing on the radio, he added, "You make a grown man cry." To which my stepmother stepped out of the back and snapped, "Excuse me? What does my daughter do to grown men?" To which he paled and stumbled over his words, apologizing, and said that she misheard him, and without further explanation, he then left, giving me a look. My stepmother badgered me about it until I explained that he was one of my teachers, and she got a really serious look, then asking, "Really, Vic? Your teachers too?" To which I quickly said back, "I don't know what to tell you. He's the only one who hits on me," and the topic was dropped from there. When Monday came, Mr. B had asked me if that was really my stepmom, to which I then said yes, and he laughed and said out loud enough for the whole class to hear. Not a great first impression, I have to admit. Things just continued to progress throughout the year. Seniors got out close to a month before the rest of the school, so with only a few days left, I was really enjoying the time I had left with my friends in that class, especially since they wouldn't be graduating yet. To get my scholarship, I had to do community service hours, and one thing I did towards earning those hours was being the captain of a Relay for Life team. I didn't make the shirts, but because my shirt had captain with my last name on it, Mr. B began darkly saying, "Oh Captain, my Captain," anytime I passed him, and he'd laugh. I was selling baked goods with my team at a small motorcycle festival in my town. It had monthly car shows and alike that we do this at, so I mean, it's not really as weird as it sounds. Anyway, at my last event, there was Mr. B with a group of 4 other men looking to be around his age. He was holding a beer and was staring at me before I noticed him. They all began blatantly calling out for me, and Mr. B just smirked and watched me. The rest of the day, he and his friends just stared at us, and when my friend and I had to go get change, he and his friends were just staring us down like prey, loudly hooting and laughing. I turned to see them all with eyes trained on us, Mr. B with the same wicked look. On our way back with the change, he ushered me over, but with it getting dark and him being with a group of men that I didn't even know, I just blatantly shook my head no and kept glancing back as I headed back to my stand. I could hear them all laughing so hard at that. It was finally my last day of high school a few days later, so I was really elated to finally be free. I'm going through my shift after my last day of class on autopilot when I then hear the sound of a motorcycle engine. I had been restocking the shelves when I heard it. Now, I had a crush on one of my customers who rode a bike, so I immediately got excited thinking it was him. My face must have dropped dramatically as Mr. B then walked in, only feet away from me. Jesus, Victoria. Just because I'm not your teacher anymore doesn't mean you should look so sad. I just shake my head embarrassedly, apologizing, hoping someone else will walk into the gas station to diffuse the awkwardness of this conversation. I try to scurry around him to get behind the counter, but he steps in my way and actually reaches towards my face, pulling on my head to try to make eye contact with him. I step backwards, almost falling into the shelving as I do. Mr. B instantly stumbles forward and practically knocks me over, pretending to catch his balance as he grips me and holds me to him. He holds me there for a moment as I push away, trying to get him off. Mr. B is easily almost a foot taller than me, and he then smiles down at me, then saying, "Not so tough without those killer heels on, huh, little girl?" It's when he asks that I can practically see unsurety of what to do next across his face. He pulls me back and studies me, and as cowardly as it sounds, I'm frozen in place, unable to pull away. He moves his hands from my wrist up to my shoulders, and then lightly shaking me and whispering, "Really bad things will happen to a girl like you in a situation like this." And with that, he lightly pushes me back, and I scurry back over to my counter. And after a really long silence of watching me, he laughs and leans over the counter again, and finally orders $1.69 worth of gas onto a pump, even though he's not even pulled up to it. And as I hand him the receipt, he holds onto my hand, not letting go. He then says, "My first name is Ryan. If you ever want to message me on Facebook, we could listen to music and have some fun. And you," he says, looking me up and down, "be safe, Captain Red. You never know what can happen." He laughs again and actually squeezes my hand before walking out and revving up his bike. He looks at me through the glass door and actually has the audacity to blow me a kiss. He never got the gas. I was really afraid that wouldn't be the last of him, but it was. He came off and on during the summer before I left, but I worked the evenings and we were so busy we actually had 2 people working at a time, so he never said anything provocative ever again. Looking back, I really wish I would have said something, but so many people liked him, and as I said before, he would make it seem okay by doing it in front of the class. He only focused his attention on me in that class, and I don't know why. I wasn't even the best looking girl in the class. I haven't been back to that area since I moved for college a few years ago, and I really don't know if I'll ever go back, because I met so many creepy people there. From what I've been told, he never went to that gas station again after I stopped working there. I know this doesn't sound that bad, but when it becomes something that I had to stress about every single day, and then seeing him randomly at work and elsewhere, it becomes unreal. So Mr. B, I really hope you never did that to anyone else. Please keep your hands to yourself, and seriously, I never ever want to see you again.
Around 9:30 p.m. on the night of August 29th, 2002, 31-year-old Audrey Heron called home to excitedly announce that she'd gotten a raise. Her husband Jeff congratulated her on the good news, before Audrey told him she'd soon be finishing her nursing shift at the Columbia Green Long-Term Health Care Facility in Catskill, New York, where Audrey worked part-time. It was fantastic news for the couple, as the extra income would make providing for their 2 children considerably easier. An hour and a half later, at around 11 p.m., Audrey said goodnight to her fellow nurses, headed out into the parking lot to her 1994 Jeep Grand Cherokee, then began the drive back home. She made the same commute to and from work every single day, driving back and forth along State Route 23 in the Jefferson Heights area of Catskill, and that night was no different. One coworker claims that Audrey drove behind her for a few minutes after leaving the office. Given that the weather that night was rainy and foggy, it wasn't long before she lost track of Audrey on the dark, rain-slick roads.
The drive from the nursing facility to Audrey's home in Freehold, New York is about 12 to 15 miles, so 20 minutes driving time at the very most. Audrey's husband expected her home at around 11:25, and he usually stayed up to greet her as she came through the door. But that night, Audrey didn't show. It wasn't entirely unusual for Audrey to have her shift extended at short notice, either to cover another nurse or because a patient required urgent care. So initially, Jeff didn't bat an eyelid at his wife's absence. He didn't even bother to call the hospital to make sure she was actually still there. He just went to bed at his usual time, completely unconcerned. Jeff later recounted that he woke up at around 2 a.m., the morning of August 30th, and noticed that Audrey was still not home. But again, due to the erratic nature of the job, he simply went back to bed assuming that there had been some kind of emergency. The following morning, Jeff awoke at around 6 a.m. to find that Audrey still hadn't returned home. He called the hospital, but was told that she'd left at 11 the previous night. He then called Audrey's mom, Shirley, and asked if she had stayed over at her place. Shirley had only just returned from a Florida vacation with Audrey's daughter from her first marriage, and naturally her mother was excited to be reunited with her, so it seemed only logical that Audrey had driven to her mother's that night. Only she hadn't. Shirley said that not only was Audrey not there, but she hadn't heard from her daughter at all since arriving back in New York State. Only then did it become evident that something was wrong, both Jeff and Shirley become increasingly concerned for Audrey's safety. At 10 a.m., an increasingly desperate Jeff got in touch with Audrey's stepmother, an ex-police officer, who helped him file a missing persons report. However, she also advised him to call around Audrey's friends to check if any of them had seen her. The first 48 hours are crucial in any missing persons investigation, and with any luck, Jeff might be able to locate her before anything untoward occurred. One of Audrey's friends, Karina, recalls getting a voicemail from Jeff at around 1 p.m. that day saying, "Hi Karina, it's Jeff Heron. We're having trouble locating Audrey. If you've heard from her, please call me, thank you." Karina has since stated that the first thing that struck her about the voicemail was Jeff's unusual tone. For a man whose wife had been missing for more than 12 hours by that point, Karina claims he sounded remarkably indifferent. You'd expect him to be panicking and anxious, she said, but he just sounded all low and sad, almost resigned. It was only a day into the search and he sounded like he'd given up. Karina had been very vocal that Jeff did not sound concerned in this voicemail, just sad. Karina had wondered why Jeff didn't contact her earlier in the morning before Audrey was reported missing, as she was one of Audrey's best friends, and Audrey had stayed the night with her before. She also wondered why Jeff sounded low-toned and sad on the voicemail instead of panicked and concerned, considering it was less than a day into not being able to locate Audrey. Karina also noted that Jeff could be rather controlling sometimes, and that Audrey had talked of him checking up on her frequently if she went anywhere without him. So, according to her, the fact that he was content to remain in the dark regarding her whereabouts for almost 7 hours is extremely suspicious. On the evening of the day she was reported missing, Audrey's friends got together to walk the route she would have driven home that night, keeping their eyes peeled for any sign of her or her Jeep. Her friends theorized that because it was raining that night, Audrey had taken an alternate route due to the poor weather. But since they knew exactly which short road she would have turned down, they figured that they would find her and her car right away. But not a single sign of Audrey was found along the entire route, almost as if she and her vehicle had simply vanished into thin air. Law enforcement initially speculated that there had simply been some kind of automobile accident, given that Audrey seemed to have disappeared while driving. Officers were told to keep a sharp eye out for a black Grand Cherokee while they conducted a foot search covering a 12-mile radius. Their search penetrated deep into the woods, covering every home, road, and body of water that Audrey's Jeep could have possibly ended up. Even a helicopter was called in at one point to aid in the search. But not a single shred of evidence could be located, something that mystified officers after such an intensive and rigorous search. Although relatively rare in 2002, Audrey had a car phone installed in her Jeep. But then police officers tried pinging the phone's location, and they soon found that the phone had either been disconnected, deliberately switched off, or that it had died. The cops also discovered that Audrey's purse had been left at home, implying she'd forgotten to take it to work with her on the day of her disappearance. This too struck her friends as unusual. Her life was in that purse, and even if she'd forgotten it, she would have probably turned around to retrieve it. It made them suspect that she actually had gotten home that night, and that something had occurred after her arrival at home that has caused her disappearance. Investigators were able to pull only one security camera tape from the area where Audrey was last seen. We only had one grainy video from Cumberland Farms in which it appears that Audrey's vehicle does leave her place of employment and basically turns left, going west on Country Route 23B. That's the last of any kind of technological evidence we had, one senior investigator later reported. We can't confirm it's the vehicle, but it appears to be, because the quality of the video was very poor and very grainy, and it does appear to leave at the time that she would have ended work. In the years since Audrey's disappearance, the police have investigated well over 1,000 leads, but not a single one of them has ever led to an arrest or court conviction. There are a couple of persons of interest, but no direct link to her disappearance, stated investigating detectives. At this point, clearly we suspect foul play. It's clearly a very frustrating case for us because there are no solid leads to follow. In 1998, Audrey and Jeff had had their first child together, a bright-eyed baby girl named Katie. But within a year, rumors flew that Audrey was planning on leaving Jeff, taking Katie with her. Yet many have testified that Jeff did not treat Sanzia very well at all, who was Audrey's daughter from her first marriage. They claimed he had a habit of yelling at Sanzia, although the girl later explained that although Jeff was harsh with her at times, she described herself as a bratty child and felt that Jeff was a good stepfather overall. Jeff and Audrey, shortly after the latter, discovered that she was pregnant with her second child, Quinn, whom she gave birth to in 2000. Soon after this, the couple moved to Freehold, New York, and began building the house of their dreams on a golf course that Jeff's father owned. Life seemed serene for the couple after that, but when Audrey vanished, neither Jeff nor his family actively searched for her, outside of a few phone calls, and they didn't appear too emotionally shook up about it either. Jeff claimed he was perfectly cooperative during the investigation and contributed financially to a private search effort, but these claims are contradicted by several news outlets who argue that not only did he ignore them, but that his monetary donations to Audrey's friend's PI fund were pitiful. They claim that for a man that came from a very wealthy background, his donation of just $1,000 spoke volumes about his family's attitude towards his wife's disappearance. Although Jeff claims his reluctance to mount a serious campaign of public appeals was motivated by his desire to protect his children from the macabre maelstrom of rumors and accusations regarding the death of their mother. A few months after the media circus surrounding Audrey's disappearance had died down, representatives of the Montel Williams show reached out to Jeff to book an appearance. Characteristically, he declined, but Aubrey's circle of close friends jumped at the offer of re-exposing her case to the public. After all, anything that might produce new leads or clues was worth the effort, and they harshly resented Jeff for turning his back on such an opportunity. Then in 2017, Crime Watch Daily attempted to arrange an interview with him at his home. Again, he declined, but the wall of silence had been so prevailing by that point that Jeff's father agreed to participate. In a segment that aired later that year, he told Crime Watch that he firmly believed that his son had no involvement in his wife's disappearance, and that it would have been easy for someone to dispose of the Jeep to erase any evidence of a potential crime. During the same segment, a police investigator revealed that Jeff had partially completed a lie detector test during the initial investigation, but that his father had essentially pulled him out of it under the advice of his attorney. Some have viewed this as highly suspicious, but considering how inaccurate the test can be, and how a faulty reading could be used to gain a false conviction, Jeff's father could well have been right to stop the test. In the light of the fact that Jeff had permitted full police searches of his home on 3 separate occasions, it looks less and less likely that he's anything resembling the guilty party. Audrey's daughter from her first marriage, Sonzia, who's not related by blood, has actually been very defensive of Jeff over the years and is a staunch believer in his innocence. She publicly stated that some of the media portrayals of her stepfather amounted to nothing but hit pieces of hack journalism that tried to sensationalize something deeply personal to her, and for all the wrong reasons. At first glance, there appears to have been no financial motivation for Jeff to disappear his wife. He came from a wealthy golf course-owning family, she had no life insurance, and she didn't have much in the way of savings either. But as you're about to hear, we can't rule out greed as a motivation for her murder. Jeff's father only partly owned the golf course that had made him rich. The other owner is a Russian national, one believed to be involved in serious organized crime, who also lived on the golf course not too far from Jeff and Audrey. Apparently, when police asked Jeff about the possibility of this mysterious Russian being involved in his wife's murder, he mentioned something curious. Audrey had mentioned walking in on an argument between the silent Russian partner, Ron, and a number of other men, who were exchanging harsh words and hushed voices. The men grew silent as soon as they detected her presence, and Audrey left feeling very intimidated. It's also been theorized that the golf course was nothing but a front for the Russian mafia, who in turn leached funds from the business until Jeff's father was in their pocket. If this was the case, Audrey's disappearance could have been meant as a warning to him of what would happen if he didn't pay up. Yet whether the murder was intentional, or Audrey died in the process of being taken, is entirely up for debate, as police have never deemed the theory worthy of investigation. In 2016, a tip came from a woman whose mother had worked at the very same healthcare facility as Audrey. She claimed that her brother had caught sight of Audrey on a handful of occasions while ferrying his mother to and from the hospice, and had developed a dangerous obsession with her. This man had a long history of indecent assault and attempted kidnapping, and he became one of the prime suspects in Audrey's disappearance. New York State Police ended up draining a pond near the man's Catskill home, while corpse-sniffing dogs scoured the nearby countryside. But like countless searches that had taken place before, not a single shred of evidence was found. However, both Shirley and Sonzia believe this obsessive individual is to blame, and purport that he could have been hiding in her Jeep before Audrey got in to leave work that day, and because the back doors on her Jeep apparently did not lock, it's then that her abductor struck. Audrey was recorded on CCTV, departing her workplace with no unusual indicators, but what happened after she left the parking lot is anyone's guess. In light of such a theory, it's safe to say the police have ruled out the possibility of a car accident and are focusing on the sole possibility of foul play. They've also ruled out the possibility that Audrey simply ran away, given her promotion at work and how much she loved her job. She was also a devoted mother and led an active social life, suggesting that if she did run away, that she'd have informed a friend or taken her kids along with her. Over the years, many tips have come in from all over New York and neighboring states from people claiming to have spotted Audrey alive and well, but as you can imagine, nothing has ever come of any of them. What's frustrating about this case is that the number one suspect is essentially incapable of committing the crime. In order to successfully evade detection, Audrey's killer would have had the resources and time to dispose of a huge automobile and essentially disappear it from the face of the earth. This would have been nigh impossible for one single person to do, unless they had some kind of subterranean body shop at their disposal. But this would suggest a network of motivated, twisted individuals dedicated on abducting and disappearing those unfortunate enough to be caught on the roads at night. And if that really is a possibility, a rational way to explain this disappearance, then maybe none of us are as safe as we'd like to believe. We're supposed to feel safe in our vehicles, machines built with safety belts, airbags, and roll cages. But Audrey's disappearance shows that we're just as vulnerable as our forebears while on dark country roads. And just like back then, predators stalk the highways in search of fresh meat. The story I'm about to tell is not as scary as it is sad, but don't be fooled. There were many moments during this time that I was scared out of my mind. Although I'm here to put some fear into readers, it's also a great opportunity to educate everyone on the dangers related to a common malady. So, turn out the lights and get comfortable. Here comes my scary tale of the nicest, but creepiest roommate I've ever had. Upon graduating high school, my parents hit me with the ultimatum, "You're a man now. It's time you start paying us rent or move out and get your own place." Heck, I wasn't about to pay my folks to live with them, so the hunt for an apartment started immediately. Fortunately, I had a job for a couple of years, so I had some money saved up. I think my parents thought I would choose to stay at home and they'd be able to get a piece of it, but I've been looking for an excuse to get away from them and they gave it to me. It wasn't long before I found a place with a friend of mine, riding his couch. This wasn't my long-term plan, of course, but it gave me a chance to get away from my parents. Within that month, I found a guy from work who had just been forced to kick his roommate out of their place for not paying as part of the rent. This dude was really cool and possibly the kindest guy I'd ever met, but he wasn't a pushover. We talked about each of our predicaments and decided I would take his former roomie's place, and it's where I would stay until just recently. We got along great, probably because we were a lot alike, and it also helped we worked different shifts. Our days off were spent on the couch playing Halo and throwing down many bottles of beer. Drug tests at work prevented us from enjoying things of an herbal variety, but we managed to have a good time anyway. Nothing out of the ordinary happened for the first few months, but one night I got a shock of a lifetime. I had crashed out early one night after working a 12-hour shift, the third of that week. I'm not sure what the time was, but at some point a loud banging at my door drew me from my sleep. In a slow and groggy state, I rolled over to see what had caused it. That's when I came eye to eye with my roommate. I was so shocked I could have jumped out of my skin. After taking a second to catch my breath, I yelled at him, "Dude, what?" But the reaction I expected never came. Turning on my overhead lamp, I still received no feedback. Utterly confused, I walked up to him and stared directly at his face. He just looked ahead, standing like a statue, saying nothing. This is when I realized that he must be sleepwalking. Although I considered waking him up, I seem to have remembered that you weren't supposed to do it, so I slowly turned him around and walked him back to his room. When we got there, I told him to go to bed, and believe it or not, he did. Very pleased with myself and still horribly tired, I went back to my room and locked the door. The rest of the night was happily uneventful. The next time I saw him, which was about 2 days later, I timidly mentioned it to him. I was unsure if he was even aware he did it, and I didn't want to embarrass him. To my relief, he was well aware of his condition. "Yeah, man, it's something I've been doing since I was a kid." Like most things in his life, he was able to laugh it off. He did, however, apologize for scaring me and assured me that I handled it the right way. I more than likely wouldn't have been able to wake him up anyway. In the future, he would be sure to lock his bedroom door and suggested I do the same. There was no guarantee it would keep him in or out, but it was worth a shot. I'd had no other run-ins with my zombie roomie for another 4 months, and when I did, I handled it the same way as I had before. After thinking about it for a while, it seemed stupid to get mad about the situation. It wasn't something he could control. Besides, there were certain protocols I could take to keep him out of my room at night, and once I did, I never received another nocturnal visit again. Sadly, by the end of that year, it would cease to be a worry in either of our lives. On December 3rd, I had only just returned from a 3-day vacation, a vacation my boss had forced me to take because I was grossly over-accrued on my vacation time. I didn't tell him, but I was hoping to combine that time with the other 3 days I had coming so I could drink all the way through the holidays till January 3rd. Since my plans had been ruined, my mood was on the bad side. I was vegging out on the couch when I got a phone call from work. The moment I saw the number on my phone, it put me in an even worse mood, but I decided to answer it in case it was my roommate that was the one calling. "Is your roommate there? He hasn't shown up for work today." Unfortunately, it was my boss. I was quick to remind him in the kindest way possible, of course, that I was not his mother and I had not seen him in a few days. My boss asked me to check his room and see if he was still sleeping, and I did because he was my boss, but he was nowhere to be seen. His bed was still messed up, which was strange. His anal retentive nature would never let him leave the house without making it. I promised my boss I'd call him if I heard from him, and I hung up. As soon as I hung up, I called my roomie, but got no answer. Doing the only thing I could, I left a message and went on with my day. There was still no return calls that evening. It really was unlike him to drop off the map like this, but he must have had his reasons. The next morning, I checked in on his room to see what time he'd finally came back, but everything still looked as it had the day before. It was definitely a head-scratcher. This type of behavior was very unlike him. You never know, though. I'd only known him a couple of years. Maybe he had a dark side I'd never seen. Shortly before I left the apartment for work, my phone rang. I checked the caller ID. It was a number I didn't recognize, but then an idea hit me. He must have lost his phone. And I answered it, trying not to laugh at him. "Is this Anthony Curtis?" The voice on the other end was not who I expected. I said yes, and his next question was if I was a friend of my roommate, and I answered yes once again. Before he could ask me another question, I asked him one. "Who are you and what do you want?" His answer threw me for a loop. "I'm sorry, Mr. Curtis. My name is Detective Jones with Littleton Police Department. I'm afraid your roommate, Daniel Grant, has been in an auto accident, and I regret to inform you he passed away at the hospital in the early hours of December 3rd. All I could say back to him was, "What?" Shock cannot begin to describe what I felt in that moment. I guess I had gone silent because at some point I heard him saying, "Hello, are you still there?" After I took a deep, jagged breath, I was finally ready to answer him. "Yeah, I'm here. What happened? Where did this occur?" I was full of questions. He should have been in his room at that time sleeping, not in public. I continued to ask the cop questions. "All we know at this time, sir, was that he was involved in a single-car crash. He collided with a power pole as he ran off the road." His next series of questions would begin to unravel the mystery. "Are you aware of any reason why Mr. Grant should have been on the road that time of night?" I told him, "That's the strange thing. He should have been home sleeping. He had work that afternoon. He had never went out at night regardless." "Well, it was strange that he was driving only wearing his boxers." That's when the whole thing clicked into place. "I think I understand now, Detective. He was a sleepwalker. He must have been driving in his sleep." Our discussion continued for a few minutes longer, and then I made the terrible call to his parents to notify them of the accident. They drove into town from Pueblo the next day. The arrangements were made to return his body to Pueblo, and the date and time of the funeral was set for 3 days later. Just to show how loved he was by everyone who knew him, our supervisors halted all work for that day to allow everyone to attend the funeral. I'm not a fan of funerals overall, but this was one I would never have dreamed of missing. Sending my best friend off right was the least I could do for him. The complete facts of the story were soon released, and it seemed to have played out just as I feared. Danny had sleepwalked his way out of his locked bedroom door, out to his car, and down the road. I had no idea sleepwalking could go this far, but after a discussion with my doctor, I learned how serious the condition could become. Despite the fact neither of us had any idea of how dangerous his sleepwalking could be, I can't help but feel a small amount of guilt in relation to his death. Maybe if we had done some research, we could have put some safeguards into place. But honestly, how safe would a pair of two 20-year-olds really have been? One of us probably would have passed out after a long night of video games and drinking and left the doors unlocked. The fact is, Danny's death was a freak accident, plain and simple. I stayed in our apartment for a couple of years more and just recently decided to let it go once my girlfriend and I found a house to rent together. I guess I stayed around so long without finding another roommate because it would have made his death more real. My girlfriend and I would often do the same things Danny and I did on my days off, and it was almost as fun as the old days, but in the end, I realized as long as I stayed in that apartment, I would never truly be able to accept he was gone. So last month, the decision was made to pass the place on to another pair of young guys from work. They had been having a hard time finding a place to rent, and since I'd been in their position not that long ago, it was the right thing to do. I truly hope they have as much fun in that place as Danny and I did, and that their friendship doesn't end in such a tragic way as ours. You might be able to describe 17-year-old David Faraday as the all-American boy. David was clean-cut, a good student, and a member of the Boy Scouts of America. He was also apparently something of a moral arbiter, having once confronted a marijuana dealer outside of his high school when the man had apparently been attempting to peddle the drug to members of the student body. After threatening to inform the police, the dealer was said to never have hung around the high school again. And although by today's standards we might consider this to be so-called snitch behavior, David was clearly simply trying to protect his fellow students from something he was concerned would affect their academic performance. He was a good person, with a good heart, and almost all of what he did came from a place of love. But like many boys his age, David found himself increasingly interested in the opposite gender, and there was one particular young lady that caught his attention over all others. Betty Lou Jensen was 16, a year younger than David, but she was incredibly popular, and her reputation as a charming, well-mannered young lady preceded her. She was also a very talented artist who took a great deal of interest in all things creative. It was at a local youth function that David got the chance to talk to Betty Lou, and his affection for her seemed to be entirely reciprocated. Betty Lou shared a great deal with him, and even invited him to visit her after school so that he could walk her home. After a few weeks of wholesome teenage dating, something of a relationship began to blossom between the two bright-eyed young people. But all was not entirely well, as there was another boy who had his eye on Betty Lou, one who was not about to let David have her all to himself. He squared up to David when the young man was waiting outside of Betty Lou's high school, and although the confrontation didn't become physical, some pretty harsh insults were exchanged, and David was warned to stay away from his new girlfriend. Other boys might have been deterred by such a display of possessiveness and aggression, but not David. He was determined to secure his place as the only boy in Betty Lou's life, and so one afternoon on their way home from school, David asked Betty if she'd like to go on a date with him, their first date, and to his absolute elation, Betty Lou said yes. David racked his brain for a solid first date idea, and given that it was late December, decided that a great way to capture that festive romantic spirit would be to take Betty Lou to a local Christmas event. And being the gentleman that he was, he made a promise to her parents to have her back home by 11 p.m. at the very latest. Rumor has it that David and Betty were planning on attending the Christmas-themed party with a few other local high school students, but perhaps this was simply a cover to reassure the young girl's parents, because what we know for certain is that they ended up driving over to Lake Herman Road in David's Rambler station wagon, parking it up in quite a well-known spot that was known to many as Lover's Lane. The whole appeal of the spot near Lake Herman is that it was quiet and unfrequented by members of the public, hence why young couples might use it to gain some privacy for certain unsavory activities. But it wasn't just infatuated lovebirds who noted the location's seclusion, because someone else wished to take advantage of the isolation for something that was considerably more malicious. At some point during their stay up on Lover's Lane, David and Betty Lou noticed another car pull into the spot, one that parked up alongside them before turning its lights off. At first, David and Betty were worried it was the cops, come to arrest them for committing lewd acts in public. But as they peered through the darkness to study the vehicle next to them, it became increasingly obvious that it was not in fact the police. All the young couple could do was watch, growing increasingly scared as the shadowy silhouette in the front seat stayed statue still, staring at them through the passenger's window. Betty Lou told David she was spooked and asked him to see if he could get the person to leave. But unlike previous encounters where David's bravery had shone through when confronted with a source of maliciousness, he too was far too frightened to do anything. But as he prepared to start up the Rambler's engine so he could drive Betty Lou out of there, The driver of the other vehicle got out and approached David's side of the Rambler. David was transfixed, frozen in fear like a deer in a car's headlights, but when he saw the mysterious stranger pull out a pistol and aim it at his window, his flight response kicked into gear. Betty threw open the passenger side door, throwing herself from the Rambler before David followed suit, but neither kid was fast enough to outrun a bullet. The stranger fired once through the roof of the Rambler, then sprinted around the back to fire another shot at David through the vehicle's rear window. Both shots hit the young man, and he crawled along the ground near the station wagon's back wheel on the passenger side, trying and failing to escape. Betty Lou, however, began to sprint away through the darkness as the first shots were fired, but the stranger was fast. He took aim and fired 5 shots at the right side of her back, each bullet striking her torso before she fell. As she lay dying in the darkness, the killer turned his attentions back to David, pointing the pistol towards his head and pulling the trigger one last time, sending a bullet crashing into his skull just behind his left ear. Apparently, the killer then simply got back into his car and drove away into the night. Sometime later, someone who drove past the spot on Lover's Lane must have seen the bodies lying in the dirt, and then rushed to call the police. David was still breathing when they arrived on the scene, but was completely unresponsive, and was dead on arrival when he was finally taken to a nearby hospital for treatment. The double homicide stunned and horrified the local community, and rumors abounded that there was a crazed, firearm-wielding madman on the loose, with it only being a matter of time before they struck again. One of the first people contacted by the police as a potential suspect in the murders was the young man who had confronted David as a result of his own jealousies over his and Betty Lou's blossoming relationship. But it was discovered that this young man had a strong alibi for his whereabouts, meaning there was no way he could have been the mysterious, bloodthirsty stranger who pulled into Lover's Lane that night. As the summer of 1969 drew to a close, journalists and law enforcement alike wondered if the teenage lover's killer would ever be found, but little did they know that the nightmare had just began, and what would follow would continue to baffle all those involved for decades to come. Because the man who took David and Betty Lou's lives that evening, the man who relentlessly fired bullet after bullet into the Rambler station wagon, would come to be known by a name that would echo through the annals of true crime all over the world: the Zodiac. Zodiac's identity remains a complete mystery even to this day. The killer's nickname originated from a series of taunting letters and cards sent to the San Francisco Bay Area press. These letters included 4 cryptograms based around a number of ciphers, one of which was recently solved by the FBI after over 50 years of research and study. We know for certain that the Zodiac murdered 5 people in Benicia, Vallejo, Napa County, and San Francisco in the 11 months spanning December of 1968 and October of 1969. It seems he preferred to target young couples, which is how he seemed to have come across David and Betty Lou while the pair were on their first date. Yet despite only 5 confirmed victims being attributed to the Zodiac, he once claimed to have murdered 32 other people, bringing his total body count to 37 victims. A killing spree that started with 2 young lovers, so excited to finally have some time alone together on their first date, never being able to imagine that it would end in such a brutal moment of painful finality. So the next time you're on a first date, don't be so quick to go somewhere secluded, as you never know who might be watching or following, just ready to turn a perfect Me and my wife have been listening to your channel since last year, and we think we might have a story that would fit well with your channel. It's been a few years since we moved out of our starter home, but back when we first moved in, we had this real nice elderly widower for a neighbor. He was retired and mostly spent his time in his backyard tending to the flower beds his wife had left behind. We had a lovely view of it from our bedroom, and most days you'd be able to see him out there, preening and nourishing the plants and generally being the most wholesome person ever. But then this one day, my husband called me upstairs and I found him staring out of the window over at our neighbor's backyard. I asked him what he was looking at, and he just pointed in silent confusion, so I walk over towards the window to take a look for myself. Our neighbor was standing right in the middle of this big, perfectly trimmed lawn, and he was just slamming a shovel into the grass over and over again, obviously intent on digging a pretty big hole. It was weird, but after some discussion, we decided that there was obviously some kind of method to his madness, so to speak. He was probably planning on installing a bird feeder or something else that would require digging a hole into the lawn. The next day, my husband calls me upstairs again. Only this time, he had this weird urgency in his voice. I go upstairs, figuring it had something to do with the neighbor's lawn, and when I look out of the window, I see something that sends a chill right through me. The hole that our neighbor was digging was considerably larger now, and it wasn't some round pit fit for a bird bath or squirrel feeder or something. It was quite clearly a grave. You might be wondering how we knew that, how we could tell the difference between a grave and just any other kind of pit or trench that might have some perfectly normal purpose or function. But the big clue was the wooden cross our neighbor had stacked on the ground at one end. Almost immediately, my husband goes over to check if he's okay, and I had to wait like 5 or 10 minutes for him to come back. The moment he walks through the door, I ask him what was said, and he just sat down on the couch and began shaking his head, telling me he didn't know. I was so frustrated. I mean, how does he go over and just not ask about the grave that had been dug in the backyard? But my husband said that he didn't want to clue him into the fact that we'd basically been spying on him, and said that when push came to shove, he got really creeped out and just couldn't bring himself to ask. He said there was something different about our nice, friendly neighbor, that he didn't seem so nice and friendly anymore. He was normally all smiles and handshakes, full of small talk and compliments and the like. But that time he knocked on his door, my husband said that there was like a darkness about him, and it left him really, really unsettled. He reassured me by saying that we'd keep an eye on the whole thing, and if we suddenly saw him dragging a body into the grave or whatever, we'd just call the cops. This was on a Saturday morning, and the rest of the weekend my husband basically camped out in our bedroom, watching our neighbor's backyard for anything suspicious. It was a Sunday afternoon when he called me up into the bedroom again, and that time, we could see that our neighbor was quite clearly digging a second hole. You have to understand what a weird position this put us in. I mean, it's not illegal to dig holes in your backyard, and it wasn't like he'd taken the time to fill the first one. But if he really was planning on doing something hideous, we couldn't be the people to say that we watched him prepare for it and didn't do anything about it. In the end, I convinced my husband to call the cops, saying it was either him or me, so he called. I watched him make the call, and I watched him tell whoever was on the other end that he was concerned at our neighbor's behavior because he was clearly digging graves in his backyard. Like I said, he'd obviously yet to put anything inside of them. At least we hadn't seen him put anything inside of them, but his behavior was obviously very, very creepy, so we thought we'd run it by the cops to see what they had to say. My husband is all like, yeah, okay, thanks for a few minutes. And when he hangs up, he tells me that they're sending a patrol car over so some cops could ask him a few questions. We didn't want to make it obvious that it was us that had called them, but we still wanted to know what our neighbor had to say about the whole thing. So when we saw the cops pulling up outside his house, we went down into our garage and listened in. One of the walls of our garage was maybe only a few feet away from our neighbor's front door, and if you opened up one of the windows, you could hear almost everything that was being said. So we do just that, and we listen as the cops tell the guy that they had a complaint about some strange behavior, and if they could head inside of our neighbor's house to take a look around. I don't even know what we were expecting here, but it definitely wasn't a really defiant sounding, "You guys got a warrant," coming from our normally friendly neighbor. We figured the cops might have one, but turns out we didn't know squat about the law and that it takes way longer to get one than just a simple phone call from some concerned neighbors. The cops ended up leaving, but as soon as they did, we basically ran back upstairs to see if our neighbor was going to do anything like remove the wooden cross, fill the graves in, or if he'd just carry on digging the second one out as if he wasn't bothered by the cops having knocked on his door. My husband was the first one to the window, but As soon as he looks out, he turns around again, white as a sheet, and says, "He's looking at us." I couldn't resist. I know I should have just taken my husband's word for it and shouldn't have looked, but I just couldn't help myself. He was right. The guy was standing in his backyard right next to the graves, and he was looking up at our window with this angry look on his face. I tried to act as naturally as possible, feigning ignorance to the whole thing, so I just gave him a smile and a wave, then shut the curtains to make it look like we weren't staring. But I did make sure to leave a slight crack at the edge so we could peek out and keep an eye on the whole grave situation, because by that point, it had basically become our complete obsession. The next day, when we woke up for work, not only was there another wooden cross staked into the ground at the head of the second finished grave, but our neighbor was working on a third one. Then, by the time me and husband returned home from our respective jobs, our neighbor was working on a fourth. We couldn't keep our mind off how the whole thing was going to end, and the worst thing was when we got into our heads that the guy was planning on filling the third and fourth graves with us, since he'd somehow evidently gotten a pretty good idea of who had called the cops on him. We called the cops again that evening and told them that we were seriously worried about what our neighbor was up to. And when our call was forwarded to the relevant officer, we were assured that they were in the process of getting a search warrant and that they'd revisit the guy's house the moment that it was signed by a judge. The thing was, we just didn't think that we could wait that long. And I know for a fact that some pretty awful things have happened while people have been waiting for a search warrant to be signed. It was my husband that suggested the cops get in touch with a relative of our neighbor, if they had any on record, and ask them to knock on his door to check on them before it was too late. Thankfully, we think that's exactly what happened, because after about a week of complete inactivity from our neighbor, my husband managed to catch a younger-looking person walking up to the guy's house with a set of keys in her hand. He asked if she knew anything about the guy who lived there, and she said yes, that it was her father's place, and he'd not been feeling too well recently, so he'd gone to stay with them for a while. She was just there picking up some of his clothes and stuff to take back to her place. We don't think she knew the extent of our knowledge of the situation, but my husband said she looked tired, really tired. So I figured whatever she knew about her father's state of mind had really taken it out of her. About a month later, there was a for sale sign up on the front lawn, and a full moving crew had showed up outside, boxing up the old guy's things before loading them into the back of the van. Then, a few days later, a landscaping crew came by and started filling in and patching over the graves. Let me tell you, they looked just as creeped out as we were. After that, we didn't hear anything else about it, and I understand why my husband didn't want to press the young woman for answers, since it already seemed like she was at a breaking point. Some people say it must have been kind of sad seeing an older guy losing his mind like that, but I'm not sure he was losing his mind, not in the way that people think. He seemed lucid as could be when he was talking to the cops. The way he just figured out who called them, or at least took a really good guess. That doesn't suggest a failing mind to me. All in all, it made for one of the creepiest, most unsettling experiences of my entire life, one I'll certainly never forget, and I'll always wonder, what were his intentions for those graves?
Years ago, my roommate Chloe and I moved into the perfect apartment in a 6-unit building. It was on a street we immediately fell in love with. Chloe and I are both in our early 20s, who moved from a small town to a major city in the last 5 years, so we felt like real adults living in this place. Within the first couple of weeks, we began to suspect we were in close proximity of an ongoing domestic dispute between the tenants in the unit upstairs. At this time, we hadn't seen or met them, so we really had no idea the context of the relationship. A man's loud, angry ranting, with no shortage of aggressively insulting comments, responded by inaudible mumbles, prompted us to think a woman may be in a potentially violent environment. Chloe and I decided we would try to listen in case things ever escalated too far, and maybe try to offer the woman help in the meantime. That's if we ever met her. Over the next 6 weeks, we continued to hear him, but we had not seen anyone, and there were no real developments. When he was really loud, we tried to record him on our phones. One Sunday afternoon, I was home alone cleaning my kitchen, which was located at the back of our unit. The man upstairs was having a very loud and long rant, and for the first time, I heard a clear response. I could make out a woman's voice telling him to shut up and leave her alone, in an almost annoyed rather than fearful tone. He did not appreciate that and began yelling at her, which eventually led to him banging something against his floor. Eventually he did one so hard that my kitchen lights began to flicker. I could see debris falling from the ceiling. This freaked me out, and I called my boyfriend Ted. When Ted answered, I whispered into the phone, "Don't say anything, just listen." The man upstairs continued to yell, but it wasn't until there was another bang that Ted could hear. I said into the phone, "That's my upstairs neighbor. He's been going on like this for a long time. I've been trying to record some of it." Here's where the story really takes a turn. Considering how clearly we could hear him upstairs, it makes sense he could make out what was being said below him. All 6 units were connected by a stairway outside at the back of the building. I heard very loud steps running down them. Next thing I know, there are 3 heavy raps on my door and an angry voice saying, "So you can record my conversations, but you can't answer the door." I was instantly paralyzed and worried he would come by the window where I was standing. After about 20 seconds, I heard the steps return upstairs and that familiar voice call up, "No one's home." I collected myself from the shock and fear of what just happened. I left my apartment to make some calls. I decided to phone my landlord first, as he seemed like he would know what to do if we were having issues with another tenant, and I was very confused about what was happening. I told him the chronology of events since moving in, and he provided me with some very interesting information. The tenants above us was a mother and son, Rita and Ivan. Ivan is 36, and him and his mom have been living in the building for 10 years. During that time, Ivan never had a job, and in the last couple of years had caused some problems for the landlord, specifically him and the previous tenant of our unit, who had moved out over a year ago, had butted heads several times, which is why my landlord had decided not to mention anything to us. He knew Ivan had some issues, but assumed it was an isolated and contained issue. The last thing the landlord had told me was that while the previous tenant was in our unit, Ivan had approached them, accusing her of installing something in his wall to listen to him. Maybe I'm dense, but this did not set off immediate alarms. Something more serious was going on with Ivan. I was still believing the woman's voice I heard belonged to someone in danger, so I called the city non-emergency police line, who sent a car over to make sure she was safe. She was, and they promptly left. After our call, the landlord began to build a case to evict my upstairs neighbors, on the grounds they were impeding on other tenants' ability to enjoy their space. Things upstairs had been mostly quiet for 2 days, until I was in touch with the landlord again over the phone. He provided me with some more information, specifically that he believed when Ivan was ranting, it was towards the previous occupant of our unit, rather than Rita. This obviously seemed odd to me, but we were still trying to piece everything together, so we had to keep an open mind. The landlord also reiterated how Ivan really changed in the past couple of years and had caused problems before. His reasoning for not giving us a heads up before moving in was that since the last tenant had moved out, he had been quiet and kept to himself. In the days after this call, the ranting started up again as we waited for an update on the eviction process. That Friday, we received confirmation that Rita and Ivan had been served with their first warning of eviction, so we expected to hear some action. Sure enough, that night while I was in bed, I heard Ivan's voice from above. "Shh, I'm trying to listen." At this point, I'm definitely concerned, but I really had no idea where this was going and how quickly. The next evening, Chloe called me while I was at work. She told me she thought she heard a knock at our back door. I told her I wouldn't be home for a couple of hours, but if she was concerned, I could leave early, or she could call the non-emergency line. Chloe told me she was going to see if anything happens, and that she would be okay. At around 10 p.m., I came home, and by midnight, I was on the phone with a non-emergency myself because Ivan had come downstairs to my back window where I was standing, asking us to leave him alone because we were harassing him. Chloe and I had been in our kitchen talking about our days, having agreed we would try to live our lives despite the situation. At one point, the subject of upstairs briefly came up, and the next thing I knew, a man I had only ever physically seen once, with long, dark, greasy hair, and a look of emptiness in his eyes, was standing at my back window, next to where I was sitting. My immediate response was to pull out my phone and start recording him. "Yeah, you can record me," he said. "Can you leave me alone? You and your friends harass my home every day." This got my adrenaline going, and suddenly I heard myself call back, "Bye, Ivan." I called the police and we waited for them to arrive. When he went back upstairs, he started ranting to Rita and said some very weird and unsettling things. He said we were sexually harassing him, and that us, the landlord, and the previous tenant were all associated. He then mentioned the bat we have beside our back door, which he wouldn't have seen at the window. Therefore, he had listened to us mention it. He also knew my name, having only ever seen me once. The police arrived and essentially told us there was nothing they could do. They knocked at Ivan and Rita's door. However, no one answered, and they stayed silent. The officer advised us to go to the station the following day and have a specific officer assigned to check in on us and monitor everything. They left, and I called my boyfriend to come and stay over for the night. In the hour after the police left, Ivan ranted sporadically, repeating much of the same things we'd been hearing in the past week. Ted came over. He heard for himself what was going on and agreed it was very unsettling. Banging came from upstairs, and Ted said he was going to go out back for a smoke, that if Ivan came outside to call 911. Ted had injured his back the previous week and was concerned if Ivan was going to try to come downstairs again. He decided to bring the bat with him. Minutes later, Ivan had come outside and was standing at the top of the stairs, yelling that he was going to knock us out. He started coming down the stairs when Ted picked up the bat, telling Ivan to stay upstairs. I called 911, and our downstairs neighbor came outside to help us, having heard the commotion. The police arrived, and I experienced some of the saddest minutes of my life. For starters, when the police went upstairs this time, Rita answered and completely defended her son. The woman we had initially been concerned was at the receiving end of domestic abuse, told the officers we were not leaving her son alone, that he'd almost been attacked by my boyfriend. The police said there was nothing they could do and left us for what felt like bait in order for our concerns to be taken seriously. They left. We heard Ivan amp up again. This time he was saying he was going to kill this downstairs, so we packed up and left for the night, each staying with a friend. That was a tough night, as we both came to realize this apartment we thought was so perfect had a pretty fatal flaw. We had no idea how this was going to end. We met up the following day, and after encouragement from our families, we went to the police station, needing real help with a potentially dangerous situation. It was eventually arranged that charges would be placed on Ivan for uttering death threats. Chloe and I each gave a testimony, and the officers told us it would be going to the apartment to arrest Ivan. They advised us not to stay there for the night, if possible, in the event he refused to be taken by them, as this could escalate things. Without a warrant, the police had no way of forcing Ivan to go with them, but I had a feeling he would be, since I heard him at one point mention that he was the one protecting their home. Sure enough, when the police came to the building, we packed overnight bags. Ivan let them take him away, despite his mother's protests, which included accusing us of lying and threatening them. We packed up our things, watched him get taken away, and we left, never spending another night at that apartment. Since all of this, there have been a few updates. First of all, we moved, and the landlord was very generous in his reimbursement to us, having known Ivan had issues that he greatly underestimated. Aside from not wanting to be sued, I really believe the landlord to be a decent guy who just made a judgment call that went completely wrong. We received a few updates on the legal proceedings, both from the charges that were pressed and the landlord's eviction process of Rita and Ivan. Ivan was released the following day on bail with a number of conditions, and we're waiting for a court date, I guess. The landlord is also waiting for a court date, having filled all the pre-required documents. The final piece to this completely bizarre sequence of events was the Facebook profile we found, having looked him up on a whim. Ivan hadn't posted in 3 years, which lined up with the timeline of when the landlord said he began causing problems. He had some unsettling posts that we provided to the police, in addition to frequent mention of a relationship he was in. He has dozens of posts about the person, with no response, including no likes on any of it. It's strictly posts made to an anonymous person who had no interactions, nor did anyone else. Having researched what I believe Ivan is suffering from, I am curious if this relationship ever existed, or if it was another delusion. That's the story. Thank you for listening to it.
When I was a senior in high school, during my last spring semester, I had taken all of the classes that I needed to take, and I had an extra hour during the day that I could use to just study. I had an entire classroom to myself for studying, but I would usually just play games on my phone. It was during my third period, so I couldn't go home early or anything like that, but it was still a nice break for me. One day, I got to my study hour and actually had some homework to do. I began working and went for about 20 minutes until I heard an announcement come over the school intercom. It was an announcement of a lockdown, and everyone was instructed to lock their doors and return to their classrooms if they were not in them. I wasn't quite sure if this was a drill or not at first, so I went over and shut the door. The classroom that I was in a wing of the school that was farthest from the locker commons and cafeteria, so I figured no teachers would come over there or hear anything. So I just went back to my homework. I will admit though, I was slightly scared, but really I thought nothing of it, because in my time at that high school, we had had 2 previous lockdowns, which were basically just false alarms. I was working on my homework when suddenly I heard a knocking at the door. I walked over to the door and saw a kid outside. I opened the door and he told me he had seen a guy in the hallway. The kid seemed to be in a panic, so I let him in the room and we locked the door. The kid explained to me that he went out for a drink of water and saw an older-looking creepy guy walking towards him. The kid wasn't able to get back to his original classroom because he would have to go past the creepy guy. I turned off the lights in the classroom and we both went to the back corner. We sat there in pitch-black silence for several minutes. I whispered over to the kid and asked him what his name was, but he appeared to be gone. Then there was another knocking at the door to the classroom. I was pretty scared at this point, but I slowly got up and walked over to the door. I listened on the other side and heard someone say police. I was shocked. I opened up the door to see several officers. One of them pulled me out of the room immediately. I was as confused as can be, but then I saw them go into the room and a short time later come out with the kid that I had let in. They led him away and they told me that he had been the reason for the lockdown. As it turns out, he was a former student who had graduated 2 years earlier. He had gone to the school and had made several threats against the school, but was seen by a staff member shortly after entering. It really creeped me out knowing I had been alone in a classroom with him.
So, for some backstory, I moved from a very small town to a relatively large city. It was for university, and I was around 19 years old. Since I wouldn't be in the new city until around September, my soon-to-be roommate decided to look for a place for us to live in the fall. In mid-July, she finally found us a decently priced, newly renovated, close to everything apartment. It was on a pretty busy road in the city. Fast forward to September when it was time for me to move in. Myself and my parents get to the building and it looks a bit disheveled from the front, and upon entering, the inside of the building was an absolute mess. Appliances in the hallways, plaster was running up and down the walls like a child had been given the material to play with, and the flooring was missing in most places. Since the apartment was actually kind of nice, and since it was my first ever apartment away from home, I was absolutely thrilled to finally have a place of my own. Now, this apartment housed many students, as well as the landlord and the superintendent, so it seemed like a relatively safe place to live, right? Wrong. My roommate had the door buzzer hooked up to her phone so that when someone rang, her phone would ring and she had the option to let them in or not. About a week after school had started, I was home since I didn't really have class until later in the day, and my roommate was at work. She texted me to let me know that someone had tried to buzz into the apartment, and when she answered, all she heard on the other end was an unfamiliar voice practically screaming,
Let me in! Let me in right now!
Luckily, my roommate had the sense enough not to let them into the building. About 10 minutes later, someone comes banging right on my door. Without saying anything, they just continued knocking for what felt like hours, although it was probably only about 20 minutes in reality. I stayed in my room the entire time with the door closed because I was absolutely so afraid of who might be standing outside my door. Eventually the knocking stopped, and when I checked the peephole, the person was gone. I felt really relieved that I had avoided what seemed to be some kind of creep looking to get in my apartment for some reason that I really wasn't aware of. Nothing too strange happened again until about 2 weeks later. Again, I was home since I was sick and my roommate was at work. I should note that my roommate was a flight attendant for a small airline, and obviously she wouldn't have her phone if she was already in the air. As I recall, there was no one to buzz the door this time. So it's early morning and not too long after my roommate left for work, and someone came banging on my door. Of course, I didn't get up to answer it because I was still sick in bed, hoping that they would just go away. We weren't expecting anyone, no packages or friends. And besides, how would they get into the apartment if my roommate's phone didn't ring for the door buzzer? When I finally think whoever was knocking at the door has left, someone actually unlocks the door to my apartment and walks right in. I was mortified. I always sleep with my room door closed, so there was absolutely no way that they would have known someone was in there except by opening the door. Since my roommate was a flight attendant, I knew it wasn't her because her flight would have been gone by this time, so there was really no way she could even answer her phone since there's no service when they're up in the air. I was frantically texting her to let her know that someone was indeed in our apartment without our permission. Where we live, our landlord must give 24 hours notice before entering the property. As I lay in bed crying and shaking out of pure fear, the person seemed to have just walked around the living room area and then left again. As soon as I heard the front door shut, I ran and locked all of the locks and put across the chain that would keep anyone from getting in, even if they had a key. To this day, neither me or my roommate know if it was the same person or someone who had previously lived in the apartment. We have no idea who it could have been. We left that apartment building only a couple months after that and moved into a more friendly and seemingly safer neighborhood. Whenever I drive past that building now, I always get the creeps. I don't think that I'll ever forget what happened.
I work as part of the loss prevention team at my local Walmart. No, I'm not saying where. I don't want to lose my job. I really need the money. The incident I'm about to tell you about actually made national news too, and with the loss prevention team being so small, this whole story could be easily traced back to me. I hate my job. Yeah, I know I said I needed it, but that doesn't mean I don't despise it. I don't like spying on people, but unfortunately that's just what the job entails. Wandering around the aisles, staring at the CCTV, watching for someone walking too fast or acting nervously. It can get really boring sometimes. Sure, there's a little action every now and then. Some meth heads tries to steal a DVD player or something. We get to play cops and robbers for like half an hour until the real police show up. But half the time it's just sad. Some young, dumb addict breaking down in our office, telling us she didn't want it to be this way. Yeah, I didn't either. No one did. That's not even half of it, too. You know how angry a lone black guy can get if he thinks I'm following him around the store. I've been called racist more times than I can remember. I'm not. I'm just trying to do the job I hate so much, but it still sucks. You really see the worst in people working in loss prevention. But the weirdest thing I ever saw while working for Walmart wasn't a junkie thief or an armed robber or anything like that. It was something else entirely. So this guy comes walking through the doors one afternoon. Nothing particularly unusual about him. Nothing to give us loss prevention guys any suspicion. I take my eye off of him for a little while, patrolling the store as it was my turn to do so, instead of watching the cameras. I just sort of forget about the guy, you know? I mean, you try to take note of little details, but you do it with so many people that no one in particular stays in your mind, unless they're like really shady looking. I wander back around towards the meat aisle, casually keeping an eye on various shoppers when I see this guy again, the normal looking dude. He's balding, has a blue shirt on, and is just standing there checking out all the steaks, chops, and cutlets sitting in the fridge units. Again, nothing unusual, but here's where it starts getting weird. As I'm walking past the dude, his head sort of snaps towards me. I remember he had light-colored eyes that looked almost empty. I said hi or whatever, just greeted the dude, and this big wide smile stretches across his face. The guy had no teeth. Not a single tooth remained in this guy's head. Just 2 rows of diseased-looking gums that I had to stop myself recoiling from. I just tried not to react. I felt kind of sad for him. Maybe he's lost his dentures or something. I wouldn't judge, you know. So I do another loop of the store, watching families to try to rein in screaming kids as impatient singletons tut in their direction. I thought about how much I want kids myself, even if they can be rascals. It's something my mind wanders too often when I'm bored on the job. But as I'm coming back towards the meat aisle, something immediately strikes me as abnormal. The blue-shirted balding guy is still looking at the meat. Only this time, he's not just, looking at all the meat. He's staring at it. It looked like maybe one steak in particular had caught his eye or something. They weren't darting around like they were before. This time when I walk past him, he doesn't look up. He doesn't even move. He's just frozen to the spot, staring down into the fridge units with this dead look in his eyes. I mean, I seriously don't think he even blinked, and I watched him for a good few seconds. After this guy, I didn't take my usual loop around the store. I stopped at the end of the meat aisle, watching this guy slyly out of the corner of my eye. He didn't move an inch. It was seriously like one of those street mimes. Normal people never really stand still. They fidget, shift their weight from foot to foot. This guy was honestly as still as a statue, and it was really creepy. I called it in on the radio, asking a coworker about the balding man in the meat aisle, if he was known to the loss prevention team. Came back negative. The guy I was working with that day had never seen our toothless friend before in his life. So as I'm watching the guy, still listening to my buddy on the radio, the toothless man begins to reach into my meat fridge and pick up a large sirloin steak, still packed in plastic. I start feeling like an idiot. Maybe the guy just likes to take his time selecting his steak. He is toothless after all. Maybe he needs the right kind for his dentures. I don't know. Go figure. Then he brings the steak up to his nose, taking a long, deep sniff of this thing through the plastic wrapper. Now, I know this guy is obviously nuts. I know the crazy kids when I see them, and this is classic crazy. But he's still not stealing anything. He's technically not even doing anything wrong. Being a little nutty isn't exactly against the law. He then rips off the plastic wrapping, and that's my cue to step in. Only when I see what he does with the steak, I freeze in my tracks. The toothless man stuffs the raw steak into his mouth, straining his jaw as he tried to mush that thick piece of meat up with his bare gums. I was stunned. It was literally the last thing I expected a guy with no teeth to do. I actually thought he was going to stuff it down his pants or something. I've seen shoplifters stealing weirder stuff and hiding it in weirder places. But to see him actually push that steak right past his lips and start chewing, God, it was the freakiest thing I had ever seen. His eyes start rolling back into their sockets. His cheeks caved in as he started trying to suck all the fluids out of the raw piece of flesh. And the noises he made, good God, if the noises he made didn't scare the life out of me. Like a kind of moaning or something, like he was getting off trying to swallow that piece of raw steak whole, more and more of it being stuffed into his mouth with greedy hands. Watching him spit the meat out, panting and gasping for air, I rounded the corner of the aisle, actually terrified at this point that he would see me as the sole witness to what he had just done. I waited, having somehow managed to half freak myself out watching that weirdo doing that. He quickly escaped the meat aisle, his back to me as he walked quickly towards the main exit. I know I should have stopped him. It was my job to. But we're trained to keep our distance from offenders that we deem violent or unhinged and just let the cops deal with it. However, part of me wanted to know why he did something so gross. Is that why his teeth were missing? What kind of person was he that he couldn't be trusted with his own teeth? The cops picked the guy up eventually. Turns out he was a mental patient off his meds. Old guy too. So probably lost his teeth through simple lack of care. I mean, that's what they thought the deal was. Whatever was wrong with this guy, he certainly had previous convictions for retail theft. The cop that we spoke with said it was his 4th offense, that he was likely headed to federal prison for reoffending. I wonder how a guy like that would handle prison. Anyway, I don't know if you guys will find this particular story scary, but maybe it's just gross or sad, a poor old guy losing his mind like that, but either way, it's definitely the weirdest thing that's ever happened to me working for Walmart.
This story happened in my freshman year of high school. I had recently moved to a new city and was unfamiliar with things. It was kind of tough for me being at a new school and having to make new friends and whatnot. One day, I had to make up a test, so I went to the history department to take it during my study hall time. And when I was done, I had to make it up to my next class, which was geography. As I was walking, I heard over the speakers that we were on a lockdown. I tried to hurry and make it to my class, but I guess it was farther away than I thought, and it took me a little longer than I expected. The hallways were already completely empty because classes were in session. I got more and more nervous the longer I was out in the hallways because I knew I wasn't supposed to be there. Then I saw a teacher come around a corner and see me. He looked surprised to see me, and I almost tried to run away, but I realized it would probably just get me in trouble. So I explained to the teacher I was just trying to get to my class. He said I shouldn't be out in the halls and that I was in trouble. He then told me to come with him, so I began to follow him down the halls. We walked to the end of the hall and down the stairs. Then he went to an exit of the school and started to walk out. I was a little surprised, but I figured maybe we were in a serious lockdown and we were supposed to leave the school. Just as we got out the door, though, the man grabbed my arm. Once he did, I got a terrible feeling. We walked a few steps into the parking lot until I heard a voice yell, "Hey," at us. Then someone yelled at the man to let me go. The man did and then took off running past the parking lot. Another teacher then rushed out to me and asked me if I was all right. I was fine, but very shocked at what had just taken place. The school stayed under a lockdown until they were able to make sure the area was clear. The school didn't have the best of security at the time, and the man had pretty much just walked right into the school. The scary part is, I don't know if he was ever caught.
So this happened when I was in elementary school, and it was around 4th or 5th grade. I was really excited for the day because, of course, it was hat day, which is when you bring $1 and give it to the teacher and you can wear your hat for the day. So the day went pretty normal. Went to breakfast, had specials, went to class, etc. All that fun stuff. Now the best time of the day came around. Lunch. So I was really excited because we go to recess after lunch, but I was also super hungry. So anyways, I get in line, get my food, pay, and sit down with some of my friends. Probably about 20 minutes or so goes by, and I was done with my food and kind of just sitting there chatting with my friends. Well, another 10 minutes go by, and I'm starting to get a little worried because we're staying a little longer there than usual. So I decide to get up to ask a teacher what's going on. The teacher just said she's sorry, and she doesn't really know herself. Another 3 minutes go by, and the principal comes down and tells all the teachers to shut the cafeteria doors. Everyone's kind of freaking out a bit, but not a lot. They're just kind of confused on what's happening. The principal then comes in the cafeteria and then says,
"Listen everyone, pay attention.
We're going on a soft lockdown, so please everyone stay in your seats and do not get up. Nobody is to be let out into the halls." And then she left. Around 20 more minutes go by, and everyone is still a little freaked out. Some people are even starting to cry. So I'm basically talking with friends and chatting with people around me, trying to keep my mind off of what's happening, when the teachers then start to close the blinds on all the windows. The intercom starts up again, and then says, "Look everyone, we're going on a hard lockdown. Stay where you are." Everyone is totally freaking out now. An hour goes by, and now half of the people are crying. I'm being a little dramatic bitch, and I basically start writing on a paper about if I don't make it out alive, I love you type things. And so I'm literally having like a mental breakdown while half of the place is crying. I decide to get up and ask the teacher what's going on, and what she then told me absolutely sent chills down my spine. There's people who are saying they're gonna start a school shooting. They're protesting outside the school, and police are outside as well. I literally just froze. I run back over to my seat and then tell all the people around me what's happening and just start hugging everyone, thinking this might be the last time that I'm ever going to see them or my parents again. After what feels like 100 hours, probably just one more hour in reality, and the intercom comes back on. They're saying that we're now on a soft lockdown again. I'm still crying my eyes out and hugging my friends. Another 40 minutes pass, and the lockdown is now finally over. We survived. Everyone is still kinda crying, but they're a bit more happy and stuff. So it takes us about 20 minutes to get out of the cafeteria. We eventually get out, and everyone's moms and dads are there to pick them up. I'm going into the classroom, just trying to think what the hell happened. After about 30 or 40 minutes of waiting while crying, my mom finally shows up. I hugged her the tightest that I've ever hugged anyone in my life, and then went home. I was telling my mom what happened all the way home. I even later heard that they were apparently going to come back on Wednesday and then shoot up the school then. Well, as you can imagine, I didn't go to school that Wednesday. Yet nothing ever happened. I was still absolutely traumatized from this event. If you're the person that almost did this to us, I truly hope that we never meet. I really hope you burn in hell for traumatizing a 10-year-old girl who just wanted to wear a hat that day.
When I was 14, my high school thought it would be a good idea to take a bunch of us New York City kids into the Catskills for a day. The idea was to introduce us to nature, since some of us had spent our entire lives living in the concrete jungle that is New York City. Seriously, a lot of us had only ever seen forests and farms on the TV or in movies, and now that I'm older, I realize how potentially damaging that is. I honestly feel like human beings are supposed to be in contact with nature, that it makes us happier, healthier, and gives us a sense of place. But I'll quit my rambling and get on with the story. So one super early morning, we load onto our school bus for the drive out into the Catskills. This is in like November too, so it was still dark when I got up, and the sun had barely risen when the driver got us on the road. I was excited at the time. I had aspirations to be in the military, and the idea of getting to wander around the woods was such a cool concept to me at the time. In the end, it actually turned out to be pretty boring and really tiring. We walked for hours and hours with our teacher telling us about different kinds of trees, animals, and weather systems that the area was home to. But we didn't even really get to see any of those animals aside from the odd squirrel that was squirreling away nuts. It turns out some of them don't hibernate at all, unlike a lot of woodland creatures. Like I said, it was all much more boring than I first thought. That was right up until I saw something carved into a tree. It was carved in really deep, obviously with some kind of knife or something, right through the bark and into the wood. I'd never seen anything like it before, and it wasn't like I wasn't a smart kid. I used to read about different religions and occult stuff quite a lot, so I was pretty confused as to what it was. To describe it, it looked like a rough figure 8, but with like dots and lines carved around it in certain places, so that it kind of looked like an octopus, only not at all at the same time. I know that makes literally zero sense, and I wish this was when camera phones were a thing, because I'd probably still have the pictures with me to link people to. Out of curiosity, I call my teacher over and ask her if she recognized it. She gives the thing pretty much the same look as I figured I had, just having no idea what she's looking at, then obviously tells me no, that she's never seen anything like it before. but that in all likelihood it's something a hunter carved into the trees so they wouldn't get lost. I'd not really heard of anyone doing that before, but I kind of figured she knew best, so I dropped the whole thing and just followed the group as we walked on. After a little while, we ended up walking right to the edge of a cliff face near a mountain. It was this huge wall of rock that just seemed to rise up out of the earth, covered in moss and stuff. Our teacher starts pointing at the rock and telling us how we can tell how old it is by the different kinds of rock that the thing was made up of, but few of us were really listening. I only really started paying attention myself as we walked along the cliff face, and I saw something familiar on it. Something big, too. It was the same symbol we'd seen carved into the tree, only like I said, this one was much, much bigger. Again, I showed our teacher, only this time, she didn't seem so calmly curious, and she seemed as freaked out as I did. Not only that, but the entire class saw it this time, but with it being the first time seeing it, they weren't nearly as scared, just the same curious I was. I asked the teacher quietly who might carve something like that into the rock, who might have the time or the skills or the equipment. She just told me she didn't know, but not to mention the ones that we'd seen carved into the trees. Plural. She used the plural, and it honestly scared me more than it should have. I'd only seen the one carved into the tree, but she'd obviously seen a lot more than I had. I just found myself hoping we'd be heading back soon. It was early afternoon by that time, and I wondered just how scary the woods would be after dark. Thankfully, I started heading back towards the bus not long after eating lunch. A little while into our walk, one kid stops the teacher and tells her he needs to go to the bathroom. It wasn't an ideal situation by any means, but with the kid being a dude, it was pretty easy to remedy. Teacher just tells him to go into the bushes nearby and deal with it, so he does. A few minutes later, we hear him tearing through the bushes back towards us, panting as he ran. He emerges with this terrified look in his eyes, like I've never seen anyone so scared before, not in real life. The teacher runs over and starts asking him what the deal is, but he can hardly get his words out. He just keeps breathing real fast, in and out, like rocking back and forth on the spot like he was losing his mind. The teacher is telling him to breathe, calm down and focus, and tell us what he saw. What he said shook our group to the core. There was a man, a real old man, or not so old. He had white hair and a beard, and he didn't have any clothes on, but he was covered in like tattoos. Oh my God. Oh God, what if he saw me? What if he's following us? The teacher had to quiet the kid before a full-blown panic attack took over the group, and we hurried back to the bus without stopping to look at anything at all. Nothing else happened on the walk back to the bus, but thank God. But I remember being really curious as to what the kid thought he saw when he went to the bathroom, and I foolishly asked. He told me exactly the same thing, only went into a little more detail about the tattoos and stuff. I asked him if he remembered what they looked like, to draw on one of them if he could. He took out a notebook and pen, closed his eyes for a moment so he could really recall. Then he drew something rough that I couldn't quite make out at first, but when he showed it, it was clear. It was a bunch of dots and lines, with a clear figure 8 in the middle.
Each year, me and one of my closest friends, who we'll call Dane, go down to visit his grandparents at their cabin in a nice, small, peaceful town in the North Georgia mountains. Me, my friend, and his grandpa are all outdoors kind of guys, so we're always looking for something fun for all of us to do around the area. One night, we decided to go on a night hike on a trail not too far from the cabin. Now, this isn't your kind of trail you're probably thinking of. It really is a gravel dirt road, but a lot of hunters, campers, motorbikers, and backpackers use it. We headed out to the trail, and right as we pulled up to the trail, we noticed that an older, beat-up, suspicious-looking black Chevy SUV with 2 middle-aged men in it parked next to the entrance of the trail. Now, even though this is a safe area, drug deals and other kinds of sketchy activity can occur deep in these woods, so we avoided going on that trail. and we decided to head down to another trail about a half a mile down the road. We pulled about 50 or so feet into a trail that was just outside of view from the road. We parked the truck, got out, and started our hike. Our hike was off to a great start until we got a mile in, when we started to hear a dog bark from probably about 300 feet away. We decided to keep going, but the dog just would not stop barking. And we didn't know if the dog was on a leash or not and could come attack us, so we decided to turn around and we headed back. When we were about 1,000 feet away from the truck, we could see a car sitting behind my friend's grandpa's truck running with the headlights on. This instantly made us worried because who would just roll up behind a random truck at 10 at night on an isolated trail? Keep in mind, you would have had to drive on the trail to see where we parked the truck. It was not visible from the road. We stood there for about 5 minutes trying to see if we could see anybody, but since it was so dark and pretty far away, it was hard to see anything. Fortunately for us, there was a pretty large tree next to the trail we were able to stand behind, so there was no way these guys could see us from where they were at. My friend's grandpa took these night vision binoculars out and get a better look, but it was still not much help. We decided just to stand there and wait for them to turn around and leave because there was no chance that we were about to go back and walk next to a random car with potential bad people in it sitting behind our truck. After about 10 minutes of just standing there, to my absolute horror, the car drives around the truck and it starts to head down the trail in our direction. As fast as we could, we climbed up this hill right next to us and hid behind a log that was sitting up on top. A few seconds later, the same beat-up black Chevy SUV we saw outside the other trail we were originally supposed to hike on comes driving down, and it went right by where we were 15 seconds ago. The car had its windows rolled down and started to slow down as it drove past us. Me, my friend, and his grandpa were terrified, and our hearts were pounding out of our chests. And we were scared these guys would stop and sit there, or even worse, get out and start looking for us. Fortunately, the car just kept driving and never stopped. As soon as the car was out of sight, we got out of our hiding spot, booked it back to the truck, and got the hell out of there. I know this may not be as scary as some others, but it was definitely pretty frightening for us. We don't know who those guys were and what they wanted. My guess is they had a stash of something deep in that trail and they thought that we found it. And I guess they were looking for us, but we don't know what for. A lot of things could have gone wrong. We could have walked up to that truck just as it pulled in. And what if they got out and looked for us? What if they slashed the tires on the truck? Or what if they turned their headlights off and just sat there waiting for us to come back? My friend and his grandpa actually went back in the daytime a few days later to that exact spot where we were hiding and took some pictures. The first picture is where we were standing, looking at the truck and the car behind it. Off in the distance, you can see our truck parked. That's exactly where we had it. Just off to the left is a hill that we rushed up from the car. The second picture, you can see where our hiding spot was. After my friend and his grandpa went back, they said we were very lucky to have made it. Honestly, we were very lucky to make it up there successfully because it seemed impossible to do it as fast as we did, especially with all the shrubs and thorns in the way. If we got up there just maybe 2 seconds later, we would have been seen. And I can only imagine what could have happened if we didn't make it up that hill, and if those guys saw us.
A couple of years back, I worked as a Postmates delivery driver on the weekends. I lived in a city at the time, so I could ride my bike to make the deliveries. I liked it because I could get more exercise. One night, on a nice Friday night in the summer, I was working for a few hours. I remember it was sunny and warm. At about 8 p.m., I got a delivery for an order of a sub restaurant. I rode my bike and picked it up, and then I rode to the address. When I arrived at the address, it was an apartment building on the edge of the city next to a park. I got off my bike and walked up to the front door. After a couple of minutes went by and nobody came, I texted the man and said I was there. A few seconds later, I got a response. He asked if I could bring it up to his room on the second floor, and he said he would buzz me in. I didn't mind at all, and I said that I would. The man let me in, and I walked up the stairs to the second floor and to the room he told me. I knocked on the door. The man opened it and smiled. He seemed very friendly. He said thank you to me and mentioned that he would give me a nice tip. Then I heard a woman's voice say thank you as well, coming from inside the room. I said no problem and I left. Then I walked back down and outside of the apartment to my bike and continued with my deliveries for the evening. About 2 hours later, I got another delivery near the same area and my route took me past that same park. But as I rode past the apartment building, I noticed an ambulance and several police cars outside of it. I was going to ignore it and ride past when I caught a glimpse of the man that I had delivered to. He was being led into a cop car. I had to stop my bike quick and ask what happened. I didn't get much information, but I did hear that a man had nearly killed a woman. Later, when I went home, I found out that the very same man I had delivered to was with a woman that night that he met for the first time, and he tried to force himself on the woman, and she resisted. That started a struggle between them, and the woman ended up breaking her arm and being knocked unconscious. The man was arrested, and the woman was taken to the hospital. It's crazy to me that I delivered to them, and they both seemed so happy just a few hours before.